How Virgil framed Dido. Virgil's Dido is one of the most important characters in all ancient literature, and she's one with a significant reception in subsequent art, drama and opera. Marlowe, Purcell and a substantial number of other playwrights and librettists have made her tragic passion for Aeneas, her rejection and her suicide one of the most familiar of all stories from the ancient world. What she's most famous for is being sexually excitable, abandoned by Aeneas, committing spectacular suicide, and that's the reputation and the version of Dido's career which first appears in our fully extant sources, and it's exerted an immeasurable influence since Virgil's Aeneid. The Trojans first visit Carthage on their way to Italy. Aeneas has a miserable affair with the Carthaginian queen, and that's followed by her suicide and curse on all his descendants. This version has resoundingly won in the cultural tradition. Dante, for example, influentially lists her in his list of female sexual deviants in Canto 5 of the Inferno, in the second circle of hell. The carnal malefactors were condemned, who reason subjugate to appetite. Semiramis, allegedly lustful queen of Assyria. The next who killed herself for love and broke faith with the ashes of Sychaeus, that's Dido, and then Cleopatra, the voluptuous and Helen I saw. A couple of years ago, I acted as a consultant to a beautiful new Royal Shakespeare company of Marlowe's tragedy, Dido, Queen of Carthage. It was directed by Kimberly Sykes, and it starred the wonderful Chipo Chung as Dido. And I began by emphasising to them that Aristotle most unusually ascribes to the barbarian city-state of Carthage a position equivalent to the Greek city-states, because usually the Greeks thought they alone had the ability to found a polis, whereas barbarians they thought lived in tribal societies or ethnes. So it's remarkable that Aristotle maintained that the Carthaginians were the only non-Greek people who created a civilised city-state. And in the course of the research I then did for the RSC, I came to realise that the alternative versions of Dido's life which survive from antiquity, unfortunately only in brief citations, fragments and summaries of lost ancient historians, but these provide the solution to a problem that's exercised me for years. Are there any female questors in ancient mythology and storytelling? What does a hero or heroine need to do in order to qualify for questor status? There are 6 fundamental requirements. She needs to star in a plot not teleologically directed at romance, sex, marriage or parenthood. She must travel through large spaces, preferably over water, purposefully and with an end in mind. She should enjoy a very special relationship with the divinity. She needs to exert moral, intellectual and or spiritual agency and possess psychological stature. She must also display courage in the face of extreme danger and leadership skills. Finally, she should provide an exemplary figure for the people of her sex. Amongst the classical candidates are the several Amazon warrior types: Penthesilea, Hippolyta, Camilla, Harpalyce, but they don't work as exemplars for their sex in the way male questors do, and they often end up dead or subdued by men anyway. Demeter, who searched for and found her daughter, is a very promising candidate, but is an immortal going to count? We can compare the Near Eastern Anat, who kills Death by saving her brother. Apuleius' Psyche, in his Metamorphoses, has some serious adventures, but her quest is for her lover. Medea travels with a purpose in the Argonautica, but she's motivated by sex and marriage. And there are the traumatised travelling heroines of the ancient novel, but their travels are all about finding their lover or husband. The closest candidates are in fact the Aristophanic heroines, Lysistrata and Praxagora, but they don't travel, like, say, Troggers or Physeter, but Lysistrata is in part a reflection of the Athenians' experience of their priestess of Athena, Polyas. The word questor is probably first documented as the questeur of Middle French, and that had a specific, although suitably Artemisian connection to hunting and hunting with dogs. The word quest was, however, associated with legendary heroes searching for a sacred object by at least as early as Sir Thomas Malory's The Death of Arthur. The Winchester College manuscript of around 1470 speaks of the Knights of the Round Table that was in quest of the Sangreal. Yet most of the recorded human culture stories before Lara Croft, who first appeared in 1996, adult female quest heroes or quest heroines were deplorably thin on the ground. And modern feminist writers and literary theorists have tried really hard to correct this imbalance. They've identified a few earlier she-questers, one Renaissance example possibly being Paladine, the she-knight dedicated to chastity in Spenser's Faerie Queen, 1590. Of her it said, "Her well beseems her quest." And a very rare exception in Western storytelling is the heroine of The Seven Ravens, a German fairy tale collected by the Brothers Grimm. And there a sister goes on a quest to rescue her 7 brothers, and they've all been turned into ravens. Others have created new quest heroines, like the titular heroine of Doris Lessing's novel Martha Quest, 1952, and its 4 sequels. But it's the heroine of L. Frank Baum's novel The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, 1900, who's now generally identified as the first significant female quest hero. A simple girl from Kansas who could search for something other than a man to marry. Other people suggest Lewis Carroll's Alice, who first saw light in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, but these two are prepubescent girls, not fertile adult women, and they seem to be allowed some adventures before submitting to their biological and social destiny. So the issue of the missing quest heroines matters because we cannot afford to ignore the ideological work done by ancient storylines. And this issue came to a head with Carolyn Heilbrun's essay, What Was Penelope Unweaving, in the mid-1980s. This feminist scholar of English literature, a friend of classicist Helena Foley, claimed that women have no story other than marriage and motherhood by which to shape their lives. The problem for Penelope in the Odyssey, argued Heilbrun, was that hers was the unwritten story, how a woman can manage her own destiny when she has no plot, no narrative, no tale to guide her. But Heilbrun suggests that the Odyssean Penelope had no story because the only story women are allowed to tell is the romance, the marriage plot, the erotic plot, the courtship plot. Never, as for men, the quest plot. And the absence of female quest heroes prevents women from escaping in their imaginations the single narrative line in which they've been configured. For women, even in the 1980s, Heilbrun suggested, few narratives help prepare them for entry into public life rather than the marriage market, kitchen or nursery. Lysistrata happily ticks most of the boxes of quester application form, and in her religious dimension has something at least in common with Euripides' Tauric Iphigenia, a priestess of Artemis and a real quester. Euripides has created the nearest thing the ancient Greeks had to a quest heroine here. Her achievements are to save her brother Orestes and his friend Pylades and a whole chorus of Greek women. They are captives, and she saves them from death or captivity and slavery to bring the precious Taurian statue of Artemis from the Crimea all the way to the Athenian sanctuary of Artemis, and she later dies still a virgin and receives a hero cult. As the protagonist in a tragedy who's also a priestess, Iphigenia in that play is unique. The Pythias of Aeschylus, Eumenides and Euripides' Ion and Theonoe and Helen are not principal parts. Iphigenia's plot does not involve marriage, a male partner or becoming a mother. She travels purposefully through spaces over water. In fact, she's been whisked away from the sacrificial altar in Ilus and has a special relationship with the divinity Artemis, exerts moral and practical leadership. And she has one Christian equivalent in the most striking of all the apocryphal apostolic acts, and one which has clearly been influenced by the conventions of the pagan Greek romance. There's a virgin heroine called Thecla, and she stakes a claim to quest heroine status equivalent to that made by the Black Sea Iphigenia. Thecla was converted to Christianity and perpetual chastity by St. Paul in Iconium, the central Anatolian city where she'd been born into an upper-class family. And the Thecla story in the Apocrypha relates how she resisted a suitor, was sentenced to be burned alive, but saved by a storm sent by God to quench the flames. She travelled with Paul to Antioch and successfully resisted the attempts of an aristocrat called Alexander to rape her. She feistily tore his clothes, knocked his garland off. Condemned to be eaten by wild beasts, she was saved again by divine intervention and is often associated, like Artemis, with an entourage of animals. Dressing as a man, Thecla led other young Christians southwest to find Paul in Myra before returning to Iconium and continuing her mission without him. So she travelled large distances with a purpose, a positive aversion to sex and marriage, displayed authority and autonomy. No wonder the earlier Christians opposed to women searching and preaching and conducting baptisms claimed that the story of Thecla was fraudulent. That's Tertullian. No wonder Thecla is important as a foremother to women in the Christian churches today. But in an interesting twist, some ancient versions of Thecla's story contain a detail which may reveal that actually she has a narratological relationship through Artemis with Iphigenia. An appended section in some texts tells of her later life and death. She travelled in a bright cloud to Seleucia, converts many, lives as a virgin priestess in a cave until her 90s. The cave itself has such power that even approaching it effected miraculous cures in both physically and psychologically sick people. The pagan doctors of Seleucia plotted against her because she damaged their business by healing everyone for free. And they assumed that she's a priestess of Artemis. Since the gods would remove all her power if she lost her virginity, even at the age of 90, they organise a gang rape. But God opens up a cavern in the rock for her to enter, thus saving her virginity, even as she dies a death worthy of canonisation. In other versions, it's at Rome where she dies underground. So in this story, the courageous, independent, much-travelled Holy Virgin Thecla, connected with healing, whose memory is preserved in her miraculous cave, is inevitably assumed by the pagans of Western Asia Minor, the epicentre of the cult of Artemis, to be a priestess of that goddess. And it's in a cave high above the ruins of Ephesus that she stays. Indeed, high above the great theatre of Ephesus, that there's an astonishing Christian painting of Thecla and Paul. These two are often depicted as a pair, but they're not united sexually, but as travellers who announce the arrival of a new god. In narrative terms, Thecla's mission is the ancient Christian descendant and nearest equivalent to the quest performed by Artemis's favourite, Euripides' Black Sea Iphigenia. But neither woman offers such a striking example of a true quest heroine, a political leader, a nation founder, as the non-Virgilian Dido. So when I was first doing my own quest for an ancient quest heroine, I dismissed Dido despite her courageous leadership of the Carthaginians and her mission to found a new Phoenician city in Africa. And I ignored her because she ruined it all by falling in love with Aeneas. It was only when I began to investigate her further for the Royal Shakespeare Company that I realised that the greatest ancient female quester of all time had been sitting right under our noses. In the versions of a story which Virgil's Aeneid triumphed over and relegated a woman's complete oblivion, she'd been exactly what I'd been looking for all along. In the main alternative version, she never meets Aeneas. She saves her people repeatedly by dint of her excellent intellect and dies to save them by her own hand, having never replaced her dead husband in her affections. And this may well be the very version which the Carthaginians themselves told and believed. So before I go into the details of this exciting alternative Dido, let's first remind ourselves of the sexist Roman imperial plotline in which Virgil so definitively framed her. Woman is always inconstant and changeable, says Mercury, in Aeneid 4, varium et semper mutabila femina, and were indeed offered a character, however sympathetic at times, who is vulnerable, emotionally extreme, and certainly takes her eye off the ball when it comes to being Carthaginian monarch. She starts well with her Stein-sealing entrance in Book 1. Dido, in all her beauty, walked to the temple of state, closely attended by numerous youthful retinue. She was like Diana when she keeps her dancers dancing on the banks of the Eurotas or along the slopes of Cynthus with 1,000 mountain nymphs. They follow in bands on either side, but she's taller than all the other goddesses, as with her quiver hung from her shoulder, she steps on her way. Like her was Dido as she walked along, intent on hastening the work for her future realm. And then, facing the goddess's doorway, under her temple dome with her armed guards around her, she took her seat on the centre of a raised throne. She was already announcing new laws and statutes to her people and deciding by her own balanced judgment. But all too soon she falls victim to her own loneliness and her ticking biological clock. She's crucial to Virgil's conception of the rise of the Roman Empire in her role as historical pre-echo of both the Carthaginian royal line of Hannibal and of Cleopatra. She delivers the terrifying curse of Carthage on Aeneas and the Romans in Book 4, telling the Phoenicians to torment with acts of pursuing hate all his descendants to come, each member of his line. This service shall be your offering to my shade. Neither love nor treaty shall there be between the nations, and from my dead bones may some avenger arise to persecute with fire and sword those settlers from Troy, soon or in after time, whenever the strength is given. So Virgil's Dido started as a great quester, but lost all her claim to that status because she was maternal, sexually frustrated, and easily infatuated to the point of losing all perspective on her duty as leader of her people. She even dabbled in witchcraft. She was vindictive, and she was eventually full of irrational hatred. She explains the hostility of future generations of Carthaginians to Rome, and is, in addition, set up as forerunner and prototype of Augustus' other great African enemy, Cleopatra VII, especially in the Actium scene on Aeneas' shield in Book 8. But the last time we see Dido herself in the closing frame in her story in the Aeneid, it's in the underworld. With wounds still fresh, Phoenician Dido was wandering in the great forest. As soon as the Trojan hero stood near and knew her, a dim form amid the shadows, even as in early months one sees or fancies he's seen the moon rise amid the clouds, Aeneas shed tears and spoke to her in tender love. Unhappy Dido, was the tale true that came to me that you were dead and had sought your doom with the sword? Was I, alas, the cause of your death? By the stars I swear, by the world above, and whatever is sacred in the grave below, unwillingly, Queen, I parted from your shores. But the gods' decrees which now constrain me to pass through these shades, through lands squalid and forsaken, and through abysmal night, drove me with their behests. Nor could I deem my going thence would bring on you distress so deep. Stay your step. Withdraw not from our view. Whom do you flee? This is the last word fate utters to say to you. She, turning away, kept her looks fixed on the ground, and no more changes her countenance as he essays to speak than if she were set in hard flint or Marpesian rock. So the dead Silo's silence has produced avalanches of scholarship. But what about the possibility that she ignored Aeneas because she simply had no idea who he was? Why would she speak to this deranged, weeping human from the upper world if she'd never actually met him in the first place? Now, of course I say this in jest, but there was a major and much older tradition in which a national heroine, Dido the colonist, never met Aeneas, never broke her vow to Sichaeus, and never broke the trust of her people. We don't know whether Virgil was the very first to connect Dido with Aeneas. nor to turn her into the symbol of eternal enmity between Rome and Carthage, nor to shape her as an anti-Stoic prototype of Cleopatra. And it's possible, though by no means certain, that the first two steps had already been taken as early as the Republican poet Naevius in his epic Bellum Punicum. Written in the 3rd century BCE, there's no fragment or testimonium which actually proves whether Aeneas and Dido had ever met in Naevius or had a relationship. Servius, in his commentary, cites Varro in the 1st century BCE for a version in which Dido's sister Anna killed herself for love of Aeneas. And Varro died in 27, Virgil in 19, so in the 1st century new mythical explanations and precedents had been demanded by all the swift personnel changes in the top echelons of Roman life. Many writers were busy making connections between Troy, Greece, Carthage and Rome. Perhaps Virgil got the idea of the love story from Varro, but decided to make Dido the abandoned Carthaginian lover, rather than her less politically powerful sister. But in my sense, it really doesn't matter whether Virgil was the very first to create that psychically wobbly Dido. His version was the one which has ultimately prevailed, unless we do something to rescue Dido from his ideological manipulations today, it will still prevail. How different would cultural history have looked if the Trojan free version of Dido's story had been expressed by a Roman poet as eloquent as Virgil, or indeed if the Carthaginians' own traditions had survived. We're presented with the great problem of the inaudibility of the Phoenicians' own voices, either from the Levant or from their colony at Carthage, where there was a great library destroyed by the Romans in 146 BCE. This is so frustrating because the Phoenicians and their Carthaginian offspring were literate. St. Augustine said in the 4th century that their language could still be heard in the streets of North Africa, that many scholars attested there having been much virtue and wisdom in the Punic books. But we've just got a few words and sentences in ancient Phoenician that we can read anyway. Fortunately, though, we have the brilliant Josephine Crawley Quinn's 2018 blockbuster In Search of the Phoenicians to guide us. A king named Kilamuwa, for example, left an inscription near the border between modern Turkey and Syria in the 9th century BC, perhaps in verse, chronicling how he had protected his people. And at Pyrgi, north of Rome, inscribed golden leaves recording both Etruscan and Phoenician, a dedication made in about 500 CE to a Phoenician goddess. But we just can't have a dialogue with the Phoenicians as we can with most ancient Near Eastern peoples. The sole claimant to being a substantial text first written in Phoenician is actually in ancient Greek. It purports to be a translation of a treatise connected with a voyage that took place in the 5th century BCE, a report of the voyage of Hanno, king of the Carthaginians, to the parts of Africa beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, which he dedicated in the temple of Baal. The first half names some places which can still be identified in Morocco. And the second half includes fantastic ethnography, which also involves the flayed skins of hairy women, and is the source to which we owe the zoological term gorilla. Now, the authenticity and date have been fiercely debated, although there's actually no reason why it shouldn't contain at least an echo of Hanno, the navigator's original Punic language report. So, can we begin to reconstruct a Carthaginian or at least non-Augustan version of Dido's tale? There are several important texts here of very different lengths. First, there's a fragment of the Sicilian historian Timaeus of Tauromenium in Sicily. He was a 3rd century BCE historian who didn't like the Carthaginians, and he wrote an enormous history. He seems to have spent most of his life in Athens and was a bookworm, researching in libraries. Now, he may well have known a good deal about Carthage, which had played a very large role in Sicilian history. And Timaeus was the first historian to acknowledge the growing antagonism between Rome and Carthage. He believed that they had been founded at a similar date, according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus anyway. But the important Dido-related passage of Timaeus is preserved in a much more obscure source. That's an anonymous Hellenistic essay on 14 notable women, and it's preserved in a manuscript with Polyaenus and some other texts on generalship or paradoxography. And its 6th paragraph, it purports to be a quotation from Timaeus on Dido, and it also calls her Theiso or Alyssa. Theiso seems to be a sort of translation of the Phoenician name Alyssa or Alishat. El means God, and Issa has become Osso. And this is what Timaeus actually says. Theosso. She was called Alyssa in the Phoenician language. She was the sister of Pygmalion, the king of Tyre. Timaeus says that she founded Carthage in Libya. When her husband was killed by Pygmalion, she put all her riches on a ship and fled with some fellow citizens. And after she'd suffered much, she arrived in Libya, and she was called Dido by the Libyans in their native language because of her travels. And after the foundation of the aforementioned city, the king of the Libyans wanted to marry her, but she refused. And she did that because she was forced by her own citizens. She pretended instead to get out of the marriage. She performed a rite to absolve her of her vow. She built an enormous pyre close to her house, threw herself from the palace onto the fire. So no Trojans here. Now, there's a reason for being open to the idea that Timaeus is referring to a Phoenician reading, since on other occasions he claims to have consulted Tyrian accounts himself, and certainly versions of Phoenician books translated or adapted into Greek did circulate, such as that by Philo of Byblos in the late 1st or early 2nd century BCE. And Tyrian documents may themselves have become available in the Greek world after Alexander destroyed Tyre in 332. Josephus, the Jewish historian, thought very highly of the accuracy and the great age of the Phoenicians' written records. Second, Josephus himself did quote extracts from a Greek writer called Menander of Ephesus. Now, he wrote a book containing information about the Phoenicians, and it was called Acts of Itobal, king of Tyre, or Antiquities of Tyre, or Acts of the Greek and Barbarian Kings. And we know it did contain information on Dido, because one phrase survives saying that she'd left Tyre in the 7th year of her brother Pygmalion's reign, and that she founded Carthage. But our next source is much more extensive, and that's just in summary made in the 3rd century CE of a huge work of historiography by Pompeius Troggers. Now, Troggers was a Gaul writing in Latin from the Visconti tribe in Narbonese Gaul, and he lived during the reign of Augustus. He was near contemporary of Livy and Virgil, but sadly we can't be sure whether his Dido preceded or followed Dido's. In general, he's much more sympathetic to enemies of Rome than other writers of the time are. Troggers traced the early history of Tyre, which involved a massacre between slaves and free, but before this, the foundation myth of Carthage focuses on the city of Tyre and the conflicts among the reigning aristocracy, as reflected in the story of Alyssa and her companions leaving Tyre. The second part contains an Odyssey along the Mediterranean coasts, with lots of special emphasis on the foundation of a city on Cyprus. And the final part relates the arrival of the Phoenician colonists in northern Africa, the actual founding of Carthage, and the death of Alyssa. In summary, Alyssa, sister of the king of Tyre, fled from her hometown because her brother Pygmalion had, through avarice, killed her rich husband, the priest of Melkart. After stopping at Cyprus, Alyssa and her companions sailed to the coast of northern Africa. Having obtained a piece of land from the native inhabitants, they built a new city, which is the literal meaning of Carthage. They had to pay tribute to the Libyan landowners. And when a native chief wanted to marry Alyssa, she committed suicide as follows. Taking 3 months for the accomplishment of her resolution, having raised a funeral pile at the extremity of the city, she sacrificed many victims, as if she would appease the shade of her husband and make her offerings to him before her marriage. and then taking a sword, she ascended the pile, and looking towards the people said, "I will go to my husband as they desired." And she put an end to her life with the sword. As long as Carthage remained unconquered, she was then worshipped as a goddess. The city was founded 72 years before Rome. So how does Troggers' account match up with Virgil? First of all, there is mention not at all of the Trojans. Dido doesn't yearn for motherhood. She doesn't want sex. She doesn't want marriage. She doesn't have emotional outbursts. She doesn't dabble in witchcraft. She doesn't have a sister. And she has all kinds of qualities as an individual and a leader, which serve as evidence for her status as a true Questor. Her father seems to have acknowledged her qualities in appointing her his joint successor, along with her evil brother, Pygmalion. She was deeply attached to her husband, the priest of Hercules or Melkart, and according to his Phoenician name, she responded to the murder of her husband by playing a very clever waiting game, dissembling friendliness towards her brother, while planning to get away with all the gold her husband had hidden. By a clever Odyssean ruse, she hoodwinks her brother into thinking that the gold had been destroyed, but she actually made off with it herself. She succeeds in persuading top Tyrian noblemen to join her in running away, to found a colony. And in Cyprus, she gets the aid of an important priest of Zeus or Baal, and he agrees to accompany her, and even to procure wives, Cypriot wives, for her male co-colonists to marry. And once in Carthage, she uses her brain again to figure out how to acquire a large area of land for her people to settle in and to build on. She's an expert at geometry. Indeed, the so-called isoperimetric problem of enclosing the maximum area within a fixed boundary is often called the Dido Problem in modern calculus of variations. And when it came to difficult negotiations with the local African Berbers, she alone saw how to create a sense of independent identity was crucial, because it would keep her people and their descendants free. She seems to have been successful in this. According to Silius Italicus, the famous Carthaginian generals later claimed descent from her other brother, one who'd come with her to Carthage, and thus the nearest thing to a direct blood descent from the chaste Dido herself. That's in Punica Book 1. But almost everyone today has forgotten this thrilling, other, feminist-friendly Dido narrative. But she did have some fans and supporters in late antiquity and in the Middle Ages. Authors including Augustine, Jerome, Tertullian and Microbius often include references to the Aeneas-free Dido when discussing Virgil's text. Most significant amongst them is Microbius, full name Microbius Ambrosius Theodosius, probably a pagan ethnic Greek, but possibly a Latin speaker from North Africa. And he held public office, and his Saturnalia dates to the early 5th century. 4 of its 7 books are devoted to Virgil, and in book 5, 17, Macrobius compares the two Dido traditions with great intelligence. Thus, he has modelled, he says, Virgil has, the 4th book of the Aeneid almost directly on the last book of the Argonautica by Apollonius. He takes the entire story of Medea's passionate love for Jason and applies it to the loves of Dido and Aeneas. And here he's arranged subject matter so much more tastefully than his model that the story of Dido's passion, which all the world knows is fiction, has nevertheless for all these many years been regarded as true. Ut fabula lasciventis Didonis, quem falsam novit universitas per tot tamen secula, speculam veritatis obtineat, et ita provera et ora omnium volitet. It wings its way as truth through the lips of all men, that painters and sculptors and those who represent human figures in tapestry take it for their theme in preference to any other when they fashion their likenesses, as if it were the one subject which they can display their artistry in. And actors too, no less, never cease to celebrate the story with gesture and song. Indeed, the beauty of Virgil's narrative has so far prevailed, says Microbius, that although we are aware of the chastity of the Phoenician queen and know that she laid hands on herself to save her good name, still they turned a blind eye to the fiction, suppress in their minds the evidence of the truth, the vere fidem promentis, and choose rather to regard as true the tale which the charm of a poet's imagination has implanted in the hearts of mankind. Well, I couldn't have put it better myself. So what happened to Dido's reputation in other and later authors? Servius, Augustine, John of Salisbury, Jerome, they all continued to read the supposedly historical Dido against Virgil's because she was useful in Christian discussions of female chastity. The medieval Dido was defined always by sex, either her ability or inability to resist sexual temptation. In the 14th century, Boccaccio was fascinated by the non-Virgilian Dido tradition, and in his prose text, though not his poetry, he privileges above her lascivious other avatar. The virtuous Dido did arrive in late medieval vernacular authors such as Christine de Pizan and John Lydgate as a Christian and chaste woman. But this takes me on to my final point. It's been a very long time indeed since the so-called historical Dido, who never met Aeneas, has had her place in the sun. She's been allowed to appear in just a couple of works. These are English musical comedies with her dignity intact. One was Thomas Bridges' Dido, a comic opera, performed in the Haymarket Theatre Royal in 1771. And the other, nearly a century later, was Francis Cowley-Burnon's Dido, a tragical, classical, original burlesque in one act in 1860. Dido does meet Aeneas, but actually settles for Iarbas, so there's no quest heroine here, but at least she's not Lasciva or in Felix either. So surely it's a time for a new creative look at our Phoenician quest heroine. With a former PhD student and now celebrated Cypriot theatre director, Dr. Magdalena Zira, I'm plotting a new theatre piece based on the alternative Dido. And she really does seem to have arrived in Troggers and Microbius from much older Greek and quite possibly Carthaginian sources. This Dido beats most modern action she-heroes into the shade, including absolutely Katniss Everdeen of Hunger Games. She would make a magnificent subject for a movie, along the lines of the recent biopic of Tom Miris produced in Kazakhstan. In fact, it's been made into a movie by the Ministry of Culture there, and in this case, unlike Borat Mark II, the movie really and truly has been made on the order of the Kazakhstan government. It's delivered throughout in the ancient Turkic and Persian languages. It's based on a narrative in Herodotus. It stars the extraordinary horsewoman Almira Tursin and is directed by Akan Satayev. The alternative Dido film, I suggest, would be a great project for the recently revived Tunisian film industry. Could feature ancient Cypriot Greek as well as Phoenician and Numidian, which is also Old Libyan, the language of the Mycenaeans, probably still reflected in the language of the Berbers. It would be really wonderful to see Pompeius Troggers getting an Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay. Thank you very much.